Before we can get too far into Python, we need to understand how to use Python variable types. Python, like most programming languages, has a variety of types, and they can be useful in various situations. Probably the most common variable type we will use are integers. Integers are whole numbers. They have no decimal value. So here's a couple of examples. We have age being 12. Age, of course, here is an integer. And then we have a temperature in Celsius, which is -43. And again, that is also an integer. In contrast, when you need a decimal value, floats can be very, very useful as well. So a temp, for example, could be a whole number, but it could also be a decimal. So in this situation, the temp is 60.4, and since the 0.4 is there, we consider temp a float. The speed limit example is that the speed limit here is 45, and even though it's a whole number, that is, it's 45, you'll notice it has 0.0. Because of that, Python will assume that speed limit is a float. We also need to handle what are called alphanumeric values. Alphanumeric means letters and numbers, as well as special characters. And to delimit strings, you can use either single or double quotes. So in the first example, we have street number, and you'll notice the number 4 there has single quotes around it. That makes street number a string. It cannot be used in a mathematical expression because of that. It can only be used as a string. And in the second example, we have an attorney called John Q. Public, and you'll notice that there are double quotes around it. That also is a valid way to create a string. Again, you can use either single or double quotes. You just need to make sure that you pair them off correctly. The final variable type that we'll use this semester is called a Boolean. Now, we don't use Booleans a lot, but they can be extremely useful, and they can actually make your code very easy to read. You can instantiate a Boolean directly by saying is equal equals true. And in that situation, is equal, of course, will get the value of true. Booleans can only take on a value of true or false. In this age situation, we create age, which has an integer value of 12. And then we set the variable can drink alcohol to be the value of whether or not age is greater than 21. Since age is 12, age is not greater than 21, so can drink alcohol would get the value of false. So again, this can make your code very easy to read. Sometimes these are a little bit harder to understand, but you'll find them very, very useful later in the semester when we do if statements. So you might ask, how does Python know what type of variable is? Well, Python is a little different than some programming languages. If you've used, for example, Java, Java requires you to be explicit in how you actually declare a variable's type. But Python's different. Python knows its variable type from the value that you give it at its creation. So when you say, for example, has been paid, and you set that equal to false, Python will know that it's a Boolean. If you set hourly wage to be 15.66, because of the 0.66 part of that number, Python will know that it's a float. And in hours worked, because it has a whole number of 40, Python will assume that the value is an integer. In the last example, because of the quotes around the name, we know that the employee name is a string. There are times, however, when you need to explicitly convert a variable from one type to another type. Let's take it a situation where you need to convert a numeric type, let's say an int, to a float. An hourly wage of 15, clearly hourly wage here is a whole number, so it's going to be an int. You can explicitly convert the float to the int to a float by using the float function. Wage will then become actually a float type or a decimal type, and when you print it, you'll actually see that it is no longer 15 but 15.0. So therefore, the float function explicitly converts an int to a float, and you'll see that result. Similarly, you can convert a float to an int. Now this is a little different. If you convert an int to a float, you don't really lose anything because it just would go from 15 to 15.0. But in this situation, a float cannot actually, because an integer cannot actually contain a decimal value, you're going to lose some information. So in the first example here with hourly wage being 15.55, that's a float. But if you convert 15.55, it will convert it to 15. Note that the int function does not round. So it will only take the integer part of the value. So the new wage will have a value of 15, not 16. If you're going to combine values, there are situations where you're going to use what's called implicit conversion. If you combine two ints, you're taking two whole numbers, so those two whole numbers will result in another whole number. So therefore, there's no conversion necessary. But if you're combining an int and a float, the result will always be a float. The reason is a float has a greater precision than an integer. If you take something like 1 and 3 and combine them, let's say add them together, the result will be 4. Those are both integers, so therefore the result will be fine. But if you take an integer like 1 and combine it to a float like 3.5, the result will be 4.5. So Python has no choice but to actually use a float so that it can contain the decimal value. If you divide two numbers, the result will also always be a float, even if the two numbers are integers. So let's take this situation. Let's take where area is 400 and the length is 50. Well, in this situation, if the area is 400 and the length is 50, the width is pretty straightforward. You just take 400 divided by 50, and it's going to be a whole number, and that is 8. But Python won't work that way. Whenever you do a division, the result of the division will always be a float. So 400 divided by 50 will result, the result will not be 8, but 8.0. There are also situations where you need to convert to and from strings. So in situations where you have model year, you can convert floats and integers to strings by using the str function. So model year, if it's 2016, you can convert the model year to a string simply by using the str function. New year, therefore, will actually be a string. So the string, the new year will, if you looked at new year and used it, it will not be 2016, but 2016 with single quotes around it. Strings cannot be used in numeric calculations. So if you try to take, for example, 2023 and subtract new year is a string now, so you will get an error. Python will throw an error here because you cannot use a string in a subtraction operation. But strings can be converted to numeric types. If you have, for example, Celsius temperature and it's a string of 40, okay, you'll notice the single quotes around it, the Celsius temperature cannot be used in a math expression, but you can explicitly convert Celsius temperature to a float by using the float function. New temp here then would be 40, and you'll notice it's 40.0 because it's a float. If we want to convert the new temperature then to Fahrenheit, we can use the calculation. We can use new temp in a calculation because it's a float. We could not use Celsius temp in the calculation because, again, Celsius temp is a string. To convert a string to a numeric type, the string must contain only a number. So if you want to convert, for example, street number, and street number is 100 Main Street, if you try to convert this to an int, it will throw an error. The reason is because it contains a non-numeric values, and so therefore Python does not know how to actually convert it. If street number simply contained the number 100 with quotes around it, Python would be able to do the conversion.